I guess I could have. The one with the weight and balance, there were some recording issues. And so I will look at re-recording certain portions of that if we need to. So, but yeah, WebEx wasn't too happy. Anyways, let's go into today's topic. So today we're going to start looking at ground operations, and this mostly ties into the general portion when you're looking at general airframe power plant and how you're tested on it. Most of this information is covered in general. When we do get into the lab, a big part of this class, and then also 4965, 4966, is we're going to try to get you running as many aircraft as possible. Usually we do all the aircraft, but you may not get quite all of them this year just because of the circumstances, but we want to get you through a lot of the aircraft. And so you'll use the information you learn here when we actually start doing that. And it applies, we're going to be looking at operating the aircraft, obviously sitting in the cockpit and being in control of the aircraft, but also the other tasks that go along with that, things such as marshaling, parking, towing, ground stuff. We're not going to cover all that today, but then we'll cover some of it now and later, and I'll show you that when we get started here. So I'm going to go ahead and share that, and then we'll get started. So airport ground ops, and getting all the windows. Every time we change views in WebEx, it closes like every window, everything we have open. So airport ground ops. There we go. The primary areas, what you see with airport ground operations are these 7 areas. So things like marshaling, and then for taxiing, we have to worry about not just taxiing the aircraft, but what are we doing around the airport? What kind of information is out there? How do we communicate with people using radios? And then run-ups, and then ultimately towing, pushback, and vehicle driving. So we're going to focus on these areas here: marshaling, airport markings and signage, radio use, taxiing, and maintenance ground runs. In 4965, 4966, then we will look at towing and pushback. We usually hook up the tugs, actually get tugs out and move the king air around to see who can get it back into some boxes. And then vehicle driving, which kind of applies to some of this. How do you safely operate a vehicle on an airport? It's a different environment than being out on the road. But the things we're going to focus on are in the yellow box there. So this is the part where I mentioned webcams are going to be important. We're going to go through the different types of marshaling, and then a little video quiz of everybody and have you stand up and do some marshaling. So I'll probably do the same. You'll see me flapping my arms around here in a second. But when you look in the documentation, the areas shown here, which I'll go into detail, are the ones that are specifically on the general portion of the test. Now there are additional marshaling signs we're going to cover that aren't necessarily part of general, but they are common enough that they're good to know. So before we get into those, though, the biggest thing that I see with marshaling and with new students is understanding how to be safe while you're doing it, and the positioning and that kind of thing. And so what we have here are some examples of where FAA is old school. They still call it the signalman, but the signalman's position. Ideally, you're looking off center and clear of things that could hurt you, especially if you were to trip and fall. A lot of times you're facing an aircraft, but you are walking backwards, or you are walking kind of sideways as you are bringing that aircraft into a spot. And so that being the case, there is a potential to trip and fall. So before you even bring an aircraft into a spot, or marshal an aircraft, you want to make sure the area is clear. And depending on the airport, this may be done in different ways. A lot of airports have they have the taxi lines marked, and anything, you don't want stuff close to the taxi lines. They have parking spaces like what our airport, the Kellogg Airport there, out on our ramp, we have the T tie-down areas that are marked. But when you get into some ramps don't have anything. Other areas you get into, like gates at larger or passenger airports, they may even have boxing or outlining that kind of show where the hazard areas are. And for instance, there might be a big box kind of drawn on the pavement where nothing can be inside that box when an airplane's going to pull in. You got to make sure all, lavatory carts and power carts and air conditioning stuff and servicing and galley service trucks and cleaning crew trucks and fuel trucks and fueling equipment, make sure that's all out of the way and outside that box, so there isn't a potential for it to for an aircraft to hit it, for it to be ingested into an engine, or for somebody to trip over it or walk into it while they're trying to bring an aircraft in. So once you've made sure the area is clear and you're clear, you're not going to trip over stuff, things like power cords, hoses, that kind of thing. You still want to make sure you maintain a safe position relative to the aircraft. And so the biggest mistake we see when we get you out on the ramp and we have you doing this is students and people learning marshal stand directly in front of the airplane, straight ahead on the center line. And the risk there is you have, on our small aircraft, you have a propeller there if you were to trip and fall. So people stand directly in front. They also tend to stand too close. And that's got two downsides. One, if you trip and fall, you don't want to be where you're going to get hit. But the other part of that is it's harder to see what's going on. You need to get kind of a big picture view a lot of times. So stepping back, standing away a little bit, is going to help you have a clear big picture view where you can see things like wingtips, tail. You need to watch the tail if the aircraft's going to be turning, and for other people and that kind of thing. So just make sure you're staying out of those danger areas and kind of off to the side, as shown in these pictures here, where you have this, they show the signaling kind of off to the side, and in this case to the left side of the aircraft, so that the pilot or the person sitting in the captain's seat is going to be on the left side. So they tend to have a better view of that side of the aircraft. Now, if there's something on the right side that's tight or a possible, something you have to watch, like a wingtip coming up near a wall or other equipment, there's nothing that says you can't move over to the other side of the aircraft. But you can always use things like wing walkers, somebody else, to help. But you need to make sure when you're doing this, it's easy you're going to be watching a couple different things. You got to kind of watch where you're walking. You got to watch the different parts of the aircraft, wingtips and tail tips and all that. But then you also have to be making sure that you got to maintain visual contact with the crew, so that they can, they can see you. And so you're kind of scanning the area. You develop a scan as you do this, kind of looking, side to side, maybe up at the wingtip. I look like I'm blessing somebody here. But you're looking at your two wingtips, looking at the tail, looking up at the crew, and kind of using that scan to make sure everything stays clear. And watching those, what are known as key areas of the aircraft. And this is particularly important. The reason we have a marshaller is in crowded or congested areas to prevent contact or FOD damage to aircraft. And so the more crowded and congested it is, the more careful you need to be. Things need to go slower, maybe double check on stuff. And that's where you start adding in, maybe you need additional people, what are called wing walkers or tail walkers, that are going to be positioned to watch a specific point, really take their eyes off. One thing you can see here is what they have are the line of sights. And so you can see this is the head marshaller out here in front and to the left of the aircraft. They can see the left wingtip, but their line of sight to the right wingtip is blocked. So they need to make sure that they can see this wing walker on the right wing. Now, what that means is that there are times where, especially if the aircraft starts to turn, or as this airplane moves forward, you can see if this airplane were to move forward and the marshaller and the wing walker stayed in their current position, you would block the view of the person watching the wingtip. And so you have to be maintaining that eye contact. So if at any time, if you lose eye contact or the ability to see a wingtip, the ability to see any kind of wing walkers or people helping you, you need to give the person taxiing the aircraft or a tug driver if you're using if you're towing an aircraft, because this can be used for towing as well. You need to give them the signal to stop and get everybody back in position. It's better to stop, reposition, wait, than to accidentally run into something. So we get into our specific marshaling. So this is I get to get up, and then I will have you get up. Feel free to join in on doing this. Maybe Jeremy and Nate can always pull up additional people and look, but different signals. You'll see the first one. You'll see Nate's nodding at me. The first signal, common signal. I'm gonna make my thing a little bigger here. There we go. Oh, I can see more people. I can see lots of people. I got everyone's camera on here, so let's do this. So when we're bringing an aircraft straight ahead, make it full size. There we go. Okay, I see everybody. When the aircraft's coming straight ahead, we're gonna bring our arms forward and back at an angle, basically telling it to come towards us. So if you want to stand up, you can stand up. If you want to sit, you can sit, but make sure we can see your straight ahead. And the motion for this, I don't have my video. I can't tell if I'm on screen here. Here's my video. Okay, so the motion for this is we have our hands and we're bringing them kind of in and out at an angle. Let's see, come on, everyone bring the airplane straight ahead. There we go. Riley, you too. Okay, so that's coming straight ahead. They're tip level or level where you're gonna do that. I can do it sitting down. I might stand up for a few of these because they start to get a little bit more involved in that. So that's coming straight ahead and towards it. And what it means is it means for the remember we're off to the side a little bit. And so it means straight ahead to the crew. It doesn't necessarily mean come straight ahead towards me. Does that make sense? If you're standing off to the side, you don't want them turning towards you. You're telling them to go straight ahead and they're fine. Okay. Every time I adjust something in WebEx, I got to reactivate. When we want the aircraft to turn, now we got to involve two hands. This is where standing up is going to be. So let's see. I don't move the chair out of the way. Okay. So when we're marshaling, if I'm facing you, if you're the aircraft, what we're going to do is we're going to point the direction we want an aircraft to go. And Graham's doing the Macarena. I'm not sure what that means in marshaling speak, but we're going to point the direction we want to go, and then we're going to kind of do a similar motion to what we were doing straight ahead. Aircraft to go to the left, which would actually be the aircraft. You would be going to your right. You would point the direction you want to go, and then you're going to bring your other hand's going to be like this. And it's still doing the straight ahead motion. So instead of going like this, now you're going to drop a hand. We'll continue to do it. So I want the aircraft to go this direction. I want the aircraft to go straight ahead. I want to see some participation here. Come on, we got a lot of people just sitting there. And we want to go to the other direction. Okay. So you're pointing the direction you want to go, and then moving. Okay. As planes are coming, as they're coming towards you, eventually you're going to get to a point where you need them to stop. And there's a few different signals you'll see. The general, they describe it in the general compared to what you sometimes see out at airports and out in industry may be slightly different. But the official way is essentially a stick them up. I see a few people. So you're bringing the aircraft in, and then when you want them to stop, you can do something like this. Now, what you'll see more common is the problem with that is there's not really, you're kind of going, and then you're stopped, right? So does anyone have an idea of how we would bring them to a stop a little bit more slowly? I see people doing it, so you can come together. This is a more common industry. The FAA calls that an emergency stop, where it's where you bring them together quickly. You quickly cross and make the X. But if you're doing this and you start to go, a lot of people bring their hands out to the side and then bring them up together and then eventually to a stop. Okay. And the reason for that, think about, especially these large aircraft, if you suddenly go from taxiing to a stop, there's a lot of inertia there, a lot of momentum. Brakes. How many of you have been, what happens at the airport when you get close to the gate with a load of passengers? Those of you that have flown recently. Well, not too recently. No one's flying right now, but any ideas? Anyone seen it?
People start to get out of their chairs.
People get out of their chairs. So if you slam on the brakes, now you have people laying in the aisle. And that just is that's not a good PR situation. So, so you want to brake, you want them to brake smoothly, that gives them that smooth braking. But if you do have an emergency situation, you got to stop, you can cross the arms, that's what that means. Earlier on, we got to start engines, and so a lot of times, so what you'll see is some of the engine start, and these are not all, by the way, there are some additional movements we'll be doing. But for starting engines, you can see the hand that this person's doing. He's kind of doing a circular hand. So spinning the engine, right, turning an engine. And so what you have is one hand holding up the engine, right? The engines are labeled single engine, just got the one, right? Twin engine, your left is your number one, your right engine is your number two. Tri-jet, quad-jet, 3 and 4, the engines work from left to right. And so what we're doing is holding up an engine, and a lot of times it doesn't hurt to point to it. So like if it's the left engine, pull up the number one, I can kind of point to it and spin my engine. Say it's a quad engine aircraft, number two, we can spin our engine. On the other side, maybe I do number three, or some people hold up three like this, doesn't really matter. Turn three, and turn four, turn five. I'm not sure what happens when you have like a B-52 or something with 6. Nate's got it. Watch Nate. I don't think that's an official. That circular motion is your engine. So that's what we do to get them started. Okay. If we need to stop engines, you've got essentially the cut signal. There isn't a official designation for which engine to cut, but you can do kind of the same thing. So if you need to cut engine 1 or cut engine 2, cut engine 3, cut engine 4, and so on. The other thing, though, is that a lot of times, like say you've been starting engine 1 and you need to cut it, kind of the assumption is whatever engine you're currently working on or dealing with is probably the one that needs to be cut. Or the other time you'll see this is after an aircraft gets into the gate. You'll usually have an APU, but you need to tell the crew that it's okay to shut off the engines if you've hooked up things like ground power and air conditioning. So that's a sign, okay, you can go ahead and cut your engines for shutdown. Although most of your crews kind of know what's going on. When you are with a marshaller, you'll have chocks in the aircraft. So this one's a little bit lower, I think. I gotta tip my camera down. And it is summer, so I'm doing the shorts look right now, by the way. So when we put chocks, to remove chocks, it's the thumbs, take your thumbs and you're pulling them out. Chocks being removed. And so if you're standing a lot of times like this, okay, to insert the chocks, turn the hands around and bring them in, What you will see, however, though, is a lot of times you're looking up into the cockpit or into the flight deck. And so the same type of motion can be done by the crew. So when they want you to put chocks in, say they've pulled into a gate, they've said, they want you to chock the aircraft, they'll look down at you, look out their window, and they'll, tell you to put chocks in. Or if you're getting ready for pushback, getting ready to taxi, you can give the marshaller the sign to pull the chocks. And then so the crew would give the sign, for instance, to pull chocks. The marshal actually physically remove the chocks from like a main gear and then get back to where the crew can see them again, and then they would give them the sign showing they did remove the chocks, that they confirm they've been removed. When you have an aircraft going, if you're taxiing in, if they're taxiing, and you realize they might be going a little bit too quick, maybe you can't keep up, maybe you can't move back fast enough, or they're just being what you would consider reckless, you can tell them to slow down a little bit. So it's everyone slow it down. Don't take off, we need to slow down. I feel like some of you are bumping there. So slow down, arms outstretched, moving up and down, but it's still just kind of turning our hands, reversing, and telling them to slow down, calm down. Okay. Mentioned that some of these are a little bit different. So rotors are similar to the engine start, except now we put our hands up in the air. And so again, you can have multiple rotors. So, rotor 1, rotor 2, I can't think of too many helicopters that have more than that. But, I guess you could if they're out there. Really the only 2 rotor I can think of are military anyways, so. So rotors, engaging the rotor. Now at this point, helicopters typically have the engines running. The engine is running. It's, whether they use an engagement system or not, depends on the aircraft. So some additional common ones, some things you'll see. These ones, right here, the little person is different. These are the ones that aren't necessarily standardized. They're not, these are actually from European regulations. These are the FAA general does not cover these different areas. But in Europe, they do have standardized ones, so that's why they have these. But we see some things similar to this in the United States. So a common one here, yep, Dakota, I see doing it, is for power when we're connecting or disconnecting ground power. And so it can be over the head, this common T up above, pulling the plug or inserting ground power. The other way you'll see it is horizontally. So, you make a hand signal like a plug, you can, a socket, a plug, you can plug power in, or you can remove power. And so those would be used those would be used by, for a crew to communicate both directions with a ground crew, a cabin crew or a cockpit crew to go to a ground crew. And so commonly what you'll see, aircraft will pull into the gate when it's ready to have ground power hooked up before shutting down, like an engine or an APU. The crew, through their flight deck window, will give you, a marshaller, the signal to connect power. You would go grab the power cart, hook it up, get power turned on. Once power is good, where the aircraft can run off ground power, you get to a point where you can see the crew again, and then give them the signal that you did, in fact, connect power. Reverse is true when you're getting ready to leave. The crew will get the aircraft powered up, they'll get the APU running, they'll get the generators online, and then they'll give you the signal to pull power that the airplane can run on its own now. So then you, as a ground crew, can go disconnect the power. Once you've disconnected it, you let the crew know that it's disconnected. They will have indications in the flight deck that you have connected or disconnected ground power, but it's still good to confirm things like that. Another one has to deal with brakes, parking brakes, and using others, and these are critical. I've had a couple incidents at the gate where this clarity or lack of clarity in the parking brake led to issues, including aircraft damage. And so that is letting the crew know, letting the ground crew know that you've set or released parking brakes. And so to set a parking brake, when you're telling someone the brakes are set, you're closing your fists, you're going like this. If your brakes are set and you want to let them know that you've released the brakes, you bring your hands up and release. And typically it's talking about parking brake, but also make sure that, for instance, if you're in an airplane waiting to be pushed back and you give the ground crew this symbol, that you also take your feet off the toe brakes. I had an incident where I was in a plane and we gave the ground crew the symbol that we released the brakes. And I was with a fairly new, someone that was learning to taxi, and they didn't realize that they didn't, they had their feet on the toe brakes, and we were using one of those low electric tugs. The ground crew gunned the tug to start pushing us back, and our nose wheels ended up on top of the tug. They basically wedged the tug underneath the airplane. Fortunately, we were able to set the brakes. The tug backed out from underneath us, and all it did was dent up the top surface of the tug. It didn't damage anything too bad. But you got to make sure if you're giving a ground crew the signal you released and they're going to push you with a tug, you got to make sure that you don't have any brakes on. Or the other thing you'll see is snap tow bars. So fortunately, it didn't actually cause damage or collapse the nose landing gear, which is definitely a possibility. So just be aware of that. But your marshaller will, a lot of times before I would pull chalk, if someone wanted me to pull chocks, I would have them set the brakes first. They would confirm the brakes were set, then I would go pull the chocks out of the way. Once the chocks were out of the way, I would let the crew know that I pulled them. But I wanted to make sure they had parking brakes set, or at least they were holding the brakes with their feet while I was going to remove chocks.
Do most pilots know these things, or is it going to be kind of like a guesswork game for some?
These are pretty standardized. I mean, everywhere I've been, every gate I've worked at, it's been pretty standard. Now, Jeremy, did you see? I don't know with the GA side so much.
Yeah, that's kind of what I meant.
Jeremy, do you know if did any of them understand kind of what was going on?
They would understand the basics, like how to come forward and turn left or right and stop. But beyond that, I didn't assume they knew anything else.
They're not really taught anything else besides what Jeremy just said.
Yeah.
Not calling out like our line service for our Cirrus, but there's been plenty of times that they've jumped over chocks, or the guy riding in the seat left his feet on the toe brakes, and then they pull it all the way down from the north or south ramp to the north, and then the brakes are just red hot because they've left their feet on the brakes the whole time. So
Those people don't work there anymore, Nate.
oh, okay. All right.
Yeah, and we'll get to it a little bit later, but like parking brakes, for instance, are just that. They're designed to hold an airplane that's already sitting stopped. A lot of airplanes, the parking brakes will not prevent you from towing it. They also, a lot of times, they won't be able to hold the plane if you pull power. But just be aware of that. So if you're towing it and it feels a little off, but it still rolls, you might want to double check that the parking brake didn't get left on the airplane. It's not a good day. So yeah, there's the brakes. We talked about this, the approaching stop point come together. So in Europe, they do standardize this, versus the US where they just have the stick them up. Europe, they've actually gone and said this is approaching a stop, hands come together at the top of the arc. So like we were showing earlier. This one, it's accepted in the US, and again, I don't know why Europe has it standardized, but we don't. But essentially, what they call a sideways figure eight or an infinity symbol is you have an engine fire or a major engine issue. And so, again, you can point, if you have multi-engine aircraft, you can do 1, 2, 3, 4. Again, if it's like engine 1 on the left, you would point, and then you're doing this kind of sideways figure eight. Let's see everyone sideways figure eight. Okay, that's to let them know that there's a fire in the engine. So 1, 2, or 1, 2, 2 on the left, doing the sideways figure eight. And I've had 2 or 3 times when I've been where we've had to do this because of an issue with an engine. The other time we had this one was what was on fire was the fuel leaking from the engine. So where a fuel line didn't get connected properly during an engine change and it was spraying out the back, it caught fire. That was pretty exciting. But it's not a symbol to panic. Please please understand that most of the time if you shut off the engine, shut off fuel to the engine, it's going to go out. You don't need to blow the fire bottles right away. But yeah, just understand, if you see a marshaller doing the figure eight thing, a lot of times they're also kind of running around and panicking at the same time. So just keep calm. But The other area you'll see this is a brake fire. So, we were pointing up, usually up is towards the engines or way out at the wings. If you see someone doing this pointing down, it's probably a brake fire, or your brake's overheated and you've done that. Again, bigger aircraft, you'll get an indication. In the cockpit, you'll probably already know that that's happening. An engine fire, you may not have the indication right away. Sometimes those take a little bit. Brake fires, you'll get a brake temp overheat on larger aircraft. So, some other ones, everything's okay. After a plane's been taxiing out, or if a crew gives like a command, you'll see them either hold a wand straight up or give the thumbs up signal. Means things are good to go. Okay, you're all clear. Being taxied out, if you're marshaling it out, when you get to a point where it's clear, where it no longer needs to be marshaled, or if there's, say, a second marshaler that they're going to go to, sometimes when you have a big operation, you'll have, rather than one marshaler following a plane from end to end, you will point, you'll bring it in, and then you might turn them, and then at some point you kind of say, okay, you need to go to the taxiway over here, you need to go to a taxiway over here, or you go there and there's another marshaler down there. That's to tell the crew, hey, I pointed this way, the crew needs to kind of look that way, and they can keep heading that direction, let's say. So those are the different marshaling commands. Real quick, I want to see what would, if you were to think about, when do you think you would want a marshaler? What kind of specific, anyone have any idea of specific conditions where these would be key, or how you would judge? If you're looking down a ramp, what would you say when would you need a marshaler versus where is like a ramp or a terminal area where you probably wouldn't need one?
Any kind of gate area, wouldn't that be a passenger unloading area?
Yeah.
Marshaler, just to make sure, because it's a delicate motion instead of just taxiing from the field.
Yeah, now if you have gates, kind of like finger gates, and you're coming down between them, do you necessarily need a marshaler all the way down what's called the alley, do you think?
No.
Why? What's the difference between that versus when you start?
And like you can see further to where you need to go, but as soon as you can't like be seeing stuff over the nose, that's when you need, or in a tight space with wingtip clearance.
Yep. So so visibility is a big part of it. Anything else?
If there's a bunch of airport traffic, like ground vehicles and stuff.
Yep. So ground vehicles, or even a lot of aircraft. Again, you're that gate area like Sam was talking about. But traffic where things can be moving around, right? You got you don't want a truck zipping out underneath. You don't want a galley truck or one of those tall trucks to get caught by a wing or something like that. So the rule of thumb, what was used at actually the two airlines I worked at, if you have it's kind of based on the aircraft size, right? The bigger the aircraft, the more the more free area you need for a few reasons. One, the aircraft is physically bigger, but the other big part of it is a crew on a large aircraft has, from the bigger the aircraft, from a large aircraft, a lot of times from the flight deck, you can't see the wingtips. Even if you look back, you got to look way back and like crane your neck. You're looking kind of through the edge of the window. You might barely be able to see the wingtip, but it's distorted by the edge of the cockpit window and all that. Our rule of thumb was if an area is 3 times the width of the wings, your wingspan, if it's 3 times the width of the wingspan or larger, you didn't need a marshaler. Okay. If it was between 2 and 3 times, usually you just needed a marshaler at the nose. If anything was less than twice your wingspan, one aircraft width to maybe 1.5 aircraft, that's where you had to have not just a marshaler, but a lot of time that you wanted to have a wing walker. And again, it was a judgment call. So you operating it, even as the flight crews are operating it, but as a maintenance technician, you'll operate the aircraft, you'll taxi. It's your judgment call to make if an area is safe or not for you to bring the aircraft in. So at the end of the day, just keep that in mind, that that's your decision. There will be company policies you want to follow, but it's a lot of times up to your interpretation too. You know, they don't give you necessarily, well, if it's exactly this many feet or that many feet, it's kind of, is it roughly this big or that big? So just kind of keep that in mind. We got a visitor. Lois has her cat. So let's see where we're at here, time-wise. Okay, we'll start getting into signage, and then for another few minutes, and then we'll call it good. I'm going to shrink you all down. I don't need to. Okay, so you all passed the practical experience exam there, even those of you without a webcam. So once we've gotten away from those congested areas, once we start getting out into the airport, now we got to start worrying about airport marking, signage, and then the diagrams that go along with it. So this is kind of a few examples of those, and we'll go through in detail what each of these mean. So the first thing is airport diagrams. Your official, what they call airport safety diagrams, are available from the FAA. And they are updated every 28 days. So it's pretty much any of your airway system, so airports, flight, all that, any of those updates are updated every 28 days. Even like the aircraft that I worked on, the navigation databases, we updated every 28 days. And so these follow that same schedule. And so you can go to the website listed here. This will be a hot link in here, but if you go to fa.gov and just search safe or airport diagram, you can find the link to these, and they call them runway safety or airport safety diagrams. And they look something like this. And this was the primary thing we used at different airports for taxiing and understanding the layout of the airport. So I mentioned that. Key information, they're going to cover airport operation areas, and the areas we're most concerned with for our purposes are things like runways, taxiways, ramps, aprons, etc. They will a lot of times include roads and that kind of thing as well, but they are primarily focused on the aircraft operation side of things as opposed to if you're driving on the airport. So you just got to kind of keep that in mind. There may be additional paved features, pavement areas that are roads for aircraft, like the Battle Creek Airport has a perimeter road. Most airports have a perimeter road that wouldn't necessarily be on one of these diagrams. So just kind of keep that kind of thing in mind. Other information that's on here in one corner, and it's not always the top right. It just depends on how the airport best fits some of these, and some of these are landscape format instead of portrait if the airport's more wide instead of long or tall. But you'll have somewhere on here, you'll have a listing of different radio frequencies for that airport. We'll go through those. Another thing you'll see, you've got these areas circled in red. Most of the stuff, pretty much everything else on these diagrams is going to be gray, black, and white, except for what they call hotspots. And these are areas where there have been incidents or where there's a high level of typically what are known as incursions, which is vehicles entering runways when they shouldn't. Not just aircraft, but it could also be vehicles driving on the airport. So there are areas that are incursions or where there have been high risks of collision, where certain taxiways come together, or where a lot of taxiways come together, or areas that are known to cause confusion. And so, some examples of those are here, and there will be a note outlining the hotspots. On this one, I'm not sure where the note is. It might be on a secondary page. But we'll look at some of those. But so they can be areas of high runway incursion, areas of possible collision, where there've been collision incidents, or areas where, if you have multiple, like if you look at this hotspot 2 here, you can see that's the one right in the middle. You've got, taxiways coming in from the left and right. You've got a taxiway coming in from the bottom. You got a runway coming in from the bottom right. You've got this piece of tarmac going north, which is actually a closed taxiway. So the risk is this is a hotspot because they're afraid people are either going to turn on this taxiway L1 and they end up on the runway 1432, or they're coming down and they end up turning onto this closed taxiway. For whatever reason, it's a pretty confusing intersection. They want to make sure that you pay attention to that when you're studying the airport, when you're taxiing. So that kind of information. Okay. Other things are building locations. You can see in black here, we have like the terminal buildings. You can also see there are things like hangars, fire stations, general aviation areas. FBO would be listed on these. De-icing pads, cargo ramps, and that kind of thing. So all these buildings are, if you're taxiing to a terminal or if you're taxiing from a hangar, that kind of thing, it's important to know where these are. Okay. Why don't we hold for a second and let me get the quiz going here. Not the quiz, excuse me. Jeremy, you have the information. You have the first one saved, right? Okay. So the end of the first hour attendance poll is open. Make sure you answer that, and then we'll take our 10-minute break and be back at 11 o'clock.